Hello, and welcome back to SpyHards podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, dangling over a computer terminal.
Very elegantly so, I might add.
Why, thank you. I've practiced.
Clearly. Well, we're here continuing our journey into the first Mission Impossible film. You've all been asking for it. We're finally here. We're talking about Mission Impossible. Are you happy, folks? Well, we hope you are. And we have a very special guest to ring in the first Mission Impossible film. Cam, who do we have joining us?
Yes, we are talking to Academy Award-winning editor Paul Hirsch, who edited the first Mission Impossible, as well as Ghost Protocol, and also some other movies you may be familiar with, say Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and a whole handful of classic Brian De Palma films. So this is one titan of the industry we have on the show today.
Absolutely. I couldn't think of a better person to have on the show to talk all about Mission and much, much more. So without further ado, Cam, roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, a man who I think I could list his credits for a very long time, but I'll keep it to this. He is an Academy Award-winning editor. He has worked on films that you know and love. Mission Impossible, Star Wars, Ferris Bueller, you name it, he's been a part of it. And he's also just recently brought out his memoir a long time ago in a cutting room far, far away. Joining us on the show, I'm pleased as punch, Mr. Paul Hirsch. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, sir. Your list of credits, I am astounded by. When I think I initially contacted you by email, I was like, wow, this guy has been a part of my life for a very long time. And I feel like I was writing my questions earlier for this, and I just thought, like, I don't know where to start almost. You know, like, it's where do you start? I guess that's probably where your memoir comes in there as well. That's a good place to start. But where I like to start these chats is getting a little bit more about you. Paul, what interested you in the first place in sort of getting into filmmaking? Where did that passion start for you?
Well, I attended university in New York at Columbia University, and it was during the Vietnam War. And I did not agree with the intention of the war, did not support the war, nor did I want to get killed. And excuse me, one of the ways you could avoid the draft was to have a student deferment.
Okay.
So after college, at that time, most of my classmates were either going on to law school or medical school or business school. I didn't want to do any of those, and I had always wanted to. I was always interested in the arts. I had always wanted to do something connected with the arts in some way, and I applied to and was accepted by the Columbia School of Architecture. And because of failing some math courses in my early years, didn't have quite enough credits to graduate, and I needed a few more points to qualify. And I discovered a program in Paris, a French language program that would give me the requisite points. And I went over there for 6 weeks, and we had classes from 9 a.m. till noon. The rest of the day we were on our own. And there I was on the left bank, and walking around, I would see movie theaters showing American movies, and they would say Raoul Walsh Film Festival. And I thought, who is Raoul Walsh? And they would say, various other directors would be on the marquee. Howard Hawks Film Festival. And I thought, who's Howard Hawks? And I started going to these movies, and this was in 1966, and it was sort of a decade in which the French New Wave had been happening, and Godard, Truffaut were making their films. And my generation of students is very interested in this. And I was surprised to see how much respect the French critics gave to American directors who here in the States were considered just to be sort of studio apparatchiks. They were not regarded as artists. And I started looking at films in a different way at that point. And there was a festival of Orson Welles films at the Cinematheque while I was there. And I went on a Monday to see Citizen Kane. I had heard the title, but I had no idea what it was about or anything else about it. And it was quite an atmosphere. The hall was packed, and the film was not subtitled in English. I'm fairly certain that not everyone in that room spoke English, but I think they went to see the mise en scène and the lighting and the cinematography and the editing and the music and so forth. And they were real, film enthusiasts. And of course, when I got to the end of the film, I was just blown away. I had no preparation for that, and it was just an extraordinary experience. And I went back the next night and I saw the magnificent Ambersons. Then on Wednesday, I saw The Lady from Shanghai. Thursday was A Touch of Evil. And Friday, they were showing, I think it was Othello or Macbeth, I forget which. And Wells himself was going to appear in person, and you couldn't get near the place. I couldn't get in. So that sort of occupied a certain place in the back of my mind. And I came back to the United States and I started architecture school in the fall. And it became pretty clear to me rather quickly that architecture and I were not a perfect fit. There was, it was just too dry. And I was also facing another 4 years for another bachelor's degree, which just seemed like too much school for me. I was ready to go out into the world. So I got a deferment on medical grounds, and I was free to pursue my life. And I got a job. I had visited a friend who was editing a film in the Columbia area. He had moved an editing bench into his apartment. He had a moviola and the various tools of the trade. And I visited him, and it was the first time I had ever seen a moviola. And in that era, there was no such thing as domestic videotape. The only way you could see a moving image in 1966 was to see it on TV and in the cinema. That was it. And there was no such thing as pause. There was no such thing as fast forward or rewind. And here was this machine where you could go forward, or you could stop, you could go backwards, and it just seemed like an extraordinary, cool thing. And you could stop on a frame and look at each of these photographs. There's one photograph after another, 24 in every second. It was just, it just seemed very cool. I didn't know anything about editing, but I was attracted to the tools of the trade, and I decided I wanted to pursue that. And I got a job through a friend who had a relative who had an industrial film company, and they would film car races. Today they would be NASCAR. They didn't have NASCAR in those days, but it was stock car races. Excuse me. And they would send out 10 cameramen, and they would shoot the race. And then the editors would cut it together into sort of a 20-minute film with narration. And at the end, they would add a tag for a company and would say, buy Goodyear tires, or buy Firestone or STP engine additive, or whatever it was. And they would sell these films to the various companies who would use them at their sales conventions. So my job was to deliver packages around town. And I would take the cut work prints from the office and take them over to the negative cutter. And I would pick up from the negative cutter the cut negative and take it over to the lab. And the lab would print from the cut negative. And then I would pick up the prints from the lab and bring them back to the office, mount them on reels, and ship them out to whoever they were intended for. So in my second week, I think it was, one of the negative cutters who I was visiting offered me a job as an apprentice. And I went back to the office, and there was an editor whom I'd sort of begun to befriend. I hadn't been there long enough to befriend him, but I said to him, well, what do you think? I mean, he said, well, you'd be handling film, instead of packages. And I thought, well, that made sense. So after 2 weeks, I gave 2 weeks notice. And I left Dynamic Films and went to work for this negative cutter. And I worked for him for about 6 months and learned the whole technical end of the business, how negative is prepared for printing and what you have to do, what editors have to do in order to, prepare the negative, and why you have to drop frames between cuts and things that are now, sort of obsolete and irrelevant. But it prepared me for understanding what went on in the editing room to a certain degree. After 6 months, I had stopped learning, and the man I was working for was a screamer. So I thought, I don't need this. So I quit, and I got a job as an assistant editor, even though I wasn't an assistant editor. But I faked it, and went to work for this guy who was working at a trailer house. They were making trailers for MGM and United Artists, and they had been doing radio spots up to that point. And they had just branched into trailers, and the editor they hired needed an assistant. So I went to work for him as an assistant editor, and they kept getting busier and busier. And after a while, he couldn't handle all the work, because he started giving me some of the things, the less challenging tasks to me. They had a 10-minute featurette. A featurette was a documentary about the making of a film.
Mm-hmm.
They had made a 10-minute featurette about the Thomas Crown affair with Steve McQueen and Dunaway, I believe. And they wanted a 3.5-minute version of it. So I cut it down to 3.5 minutes, and they liked that. So then they gave me another one to do from scratch on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Right, yeah.
So I did the featurette for that. And then they started giving me trailers to cut. And that was it. I started cutting trailers for about a year. During that time, my brother had secured a job as a low-level executive at Universal Pictures in New York, who was tasked with finding writing and directing talent. And young filmmakers in New York would come to him with projects looking for financing. And one of the directors who came to him looking for backing from Universal was Brian De Palma. And my brother and he came up with an idea for a film, and Universal rejected it. So they decided to make it on their own. My brother had a 2-week vacation coming, and they shot the film during the 2 weeks. And Brian edited it himself. And then when it was done, they needed a trailer for it. So they came to me to cut the trailer, which is how I met Brian. And he and I hit it off. And the film was sort of a minor success. It won the Silver Bear at Berlin that year. And they got the financing for a sequel to be entitled Son of Greetings. But we changed the title. That was my first. So Brian invited me to cut the film. And that was my first film. I was 23 years old, and I didn't know anything.
Right.
But I went into it with the confidence of the ignorant. I can do this. I know I could cut a feature. Sure, I can do that. I didn't know what I was doing. And so that was my first experience. And then the first 5 films I cut were all for Brian. He was the only director who offered me any work. And then during the 5th film that I cut for Brian, I was offered another job to join. A friend of his had done a film that was kind of in trouble, and they brought me in to help out, and that was Star Wars.
Right. And sorry, I just have to interrupt. I have a question just about your movie trailer period. You were working at United Artists, MGM.
Yeah.
This is a question we've kind of actually happened upon in the past, sometimes with directors who worked in a similar field. Did you ever work on a James Bond trailer during that time period?
No.
Oh, okay.
To be precise, I was working for an independent company whose clients were MGM and United Artists.
Fair enough. Okay. And then with De Palma, what do you think it was that, like, made you two click so well? Like, what sensibilities, or was it influences, or what made you two of you such an effective team?
I don't know. It's just personality. I think what makes you click with another person. It's hard to say.
Hmm. And so much of his work is driven by like a love of Hitchcock. Was that a case with you, or with Hitchcock's editor George Tomasini? Was there any influence on you there?
No, I've given some talks lately, and one of the questions I asked audiences to think about is this: would you say that editing is an invention, or is it a discovery?
Right.
I think that it is a discovery that was facilitated by an invention, so that um, the invention of film made us discover that the mind could comprehend a succession of images and interpret them as a story. And this is an ability that was unknown because it had never been presented to anybody before. But once the invention was made, then the discovery could be made subsequently.
Mm-hmm.
So the influence was, it's funny, Walter Murch and I had the same experience where we weren't instructed by anyone, but we discovered it on our own by trying things. I call it trial and success rather than trial and error. I would try something and I go, oh, that works. That's interesting. And so it was really, the influence is the feedback you get from your own work, where if you do it well, you know it, and if you do it wrong, you know it. So that was the influence. I liken the process to the games they used to have in newspapers called "What's Wrong with This Picture," where they would show a picture and you'd say, the game was, well, there's a cow on the roof, or the car has 5 wheels, or the dog has 3 legs, or whatever. You find the things that are wrong with the picture, and that's what cutting a movie is like. You watch what you've done, and you say, what's wrong with this picture? This goes too slowly. This goes too fast. This is in the wrong place. This is confusing. This is boring. Whatever your reaction is to what you're watching. So it's a process that relies heavily on intuition and instinct. And so the question of influence is, I wouldn't link it to a particular editor, although I have admired particular editors, but I think in the process of watching films, you see things that other editors have done and you think, oh, I like that. I'm going to try that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating is that because film is so international, you can be influenced by things that you see in Korean films or in German films or whatever. So I think editors and filmmakers see each other's films, and there's a cross fertilization of ideas that goes on internationally, and in fact, when sound came in, that was really crippling for the internationalism of films, because up to that point, silent films, you could just pop in any language card, and that's how Charlie Chaplin became the most famous person in the world, because his films were distributed universally.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most famous figures of the 20th century. And then, of course, when sound came in, it limited the appeal because everything had to be translated and dubbed or subtitled or whatever. So it's a different experience. Yeah, I think I lost the point.
Well, I was going to lead us into Mission Impossible, but you kind of rather beautifully took us to Star Wars, which is something I was going to bring up when you were saying about getting connected with that after your first few films with Brian De Palma. You mentioned it was having a bit of trouble. And it had a bit of, Star Wars A New Hope, as it's now known, it had a bit of a troubled upbringing. What were you tasked with when you were brought in to help on the film?
Well, I was the 4th editor hired on the film. The original editor was an English editor who was let go when principal photography ended, and George and Marshall Lucas left the UK for the United States. And Marcia didn't want to work on the film originally, but she jumped in because she saw the need, and George really needed her. And they had hired a San Francisco editor named Richard Chu, who was already working on the film. So he and Marcia were working together and recutting the work that had been done by the English editor, which was so unsatisfactory. And they realized rather quickly that they needed more help. That the two of them, it was just too big a job for just the two of them. So that's when I was asked to come on. I had to finish Carrie before I was available, so I joined them at the end of September of that year, 76. And the three of us worked together for 3 months, October, November, December. And at the end of December, my deal was up. I was hired to the end of the year. And Marcia came to speak to me, and I thought she was going to say, listen, you've been a great help. Thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck. Mm. But instead, she said, Martin Scorsese's editor has passed away, and Marty needs me to cut New York, New York. Mm. And George wants to finish the picture with just one editor, and he wants it to be you. So I said, oh, I was surprised because I thought because Richard had been hired before me, that his job, was past the end of the year, but it was not. It was the same deal I had. So George chose me, and I stayed on, and then I was the editor for the subsequent 5 months till the picture came out. And eventually I had a chance to, sort of go over every scene and sort of run it through my typewriter, as it were.
Right. And that movie, you hear so much about kind of these legendary screenings where George Lucas showed it to his friends and they were all kind of like, you're in trouble. I was just curious, were you at any of those screenings?
Yeah, well, there was one. It was the director's screening, it was called.
Yeah.
I was there. And I think, the reports are inaccurate. Some felt, he was in trouble. And you have to understand also that when we showed it to them, it was in extremely rough shape. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have many of the ILM special effects yet. And all the exterior of the spaceships were indicated by stand-in shots that were borrowed from World War II fighter plane dramas. And some of them were actual documentary footage from the Second World War. It was all black and white footage of Japanese Zeros and American fighter planes and so forth. And it's all South Pacific kind of black and white footage. So you'd have, one of the Imperial, or a rebel in a cockpit, and you cut to a black and white exterior of a propeller plane, and that was meant to be the exterior of the ship. And then, so, in all fairness, to see a film in such a rough shape is very hard. It's usually not a good idea to leave anything to the imagination. Mm-hmm. And in that phase of the process, a lot had to be left to the imagination just because we didn't have the shots. So, but I think, I think Spielberg thought it was going to be fantastic. Brian is a big tease, and he likes to kid around, and he said, George, what is this Force stuff? Please, what is this Force? Get rid of the Force stuff, So, and then he said, what's this tractor beam? What is that? So George explained what the tractor beam was. He said, oh, you mean the big magnet? Oh, nice. Big magnet. So anyway, and he liked to needle. Brian likes to needle people. I always consider myself a human pincushion when I worked with him. He's got a wonderful sardonic personality. Anyway, so, but whenever, what everyone agreed on was that the prologue, as it was written at that time, needed rewriting. Mm. So that was the main thing that came out of that screening. But other than that, it was just a question of polishing and finishing and addressing issues that we already knew were an issue, were a problem. And there was a period of reshooting where we picked up additional shots that we had, determined to be necessary through our editing work. Shots of the land speeder. There's some additional shots of the R2 in the canyon when he's captured, and there was some. George was unhappy with the cantina sequence and reshot all the aliens in the cantina. So there was a lot, but yeah, no, I thought everyone was very supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Scorsese was supposed to be there, but we got word that he had an asthma attack and couldn't come. But I think it was later determined that he was afraid he wouldn't like it, so he didn't want to come and be the skunk in the garden party. So
right. Well, that's very polite then. I am curious. When you finish your edit and you've seen the finished product, how confident are you in the film versus obviously the explosion of popularity that follows?
Well, I felt confident about Star Wars, but subsequently in my later career, I had the experience of being very confident going into a preview and discovering that it was not at all reality-based confidence, But at that time, George said to me, "We're going to preview the film," and I asked Marcia to get a week away from Marty so she could help with changes after the preview. And I had done 5 pictures with Brian at that point, and we had never previewed the picture. Just not part of my experience. So I said, "Well, what would we change?" He said, "Previews always mean changes." I said, "Okay." So we previewed the picture, and the response was phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And I went outside afterwards, and I said to George, I said, "What do you think?" He says, "Well, I guess we'll leave it alone."
And the rest is history.
That's his history. So, because we'd been over by that time, we'd been over it with a fine-tooth comb again and again and again and again. So,
and when you edited Empire,
yes,
was it easier? Like having kind of created the Star Wars language in the first one, was Empire an easier project, or was it also pretty difficult to figure out?
Well, it's always easier to get it right in the first place than to recut somebody else's bad work. So. Sometimes you're looking for 2 frames to add to a cut. Something's been cut short. You have to look for the trim and add it on, and so it's easier to get it right in the first place. And I was in control because I was the only editor on the picture. So in that sense, it was easier. And plus, it was a different director, so it was different. It was a different ball game. I mean, Kirshner was a very experienced director and brought a lot to the film, and the film has a much more polished look, I would say. Mm-hmm. But the first film invented everything. So when people ask me, "What's your favorite?" I have to always give credit to the first film because that's where everything came from.
Right. Were you ever talked to about doing Return of the Jedi?
I was talked to by saying, I had a conversation with Gary Kurtz, and he said, George has hired Richard Marquand to direct the film. And the Star Wars films employed upwards of 800 people on the crews and so forth. And Marquand had requested that he be allowed to hire 2 people on the film, his cinematographer and his editor. And George agreed. So that was it.
Right.
And at the time, I would have liked to do the 3rd film as well. But in retrospect, I don't know if it's just me, but I don't think it stands up to the first 2.
I was just about to say, I think of all the films in the Star Wars universe you could have touched, you touched the best 2. And I don't know. There are things that could be done with Jedi. I mean, what are your thoughts on Return of the Jedi? Could you have changed anything with it from what you saw of the film?
I don't know. I mean, I saw it people ask me, what I was asked recently, what's your favorite of the Star Wars films that you didn't work on?
Mm.
Yeah, and I thought, well, I only saw them once when they came out, so I don't really have any strong recollection of any of them. I think I started watching a little bit of Jedi recently, and I thought it just seemed silly to me. It sort of went off in an odd direction right from the get-go. This sort of galley ship or something. It's just.
There's definitely like a tonal pivot in Return of the Jedi. I did have one last Star Wars question before I think we move on to Mission Impossible, and that's sort of a post your involvement, and that's George Lucas sort of going back and editing the films himself, basically adding in new effects and changing some scenes and bits and bobs.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen the edited versions of the films, the special editions, I think is what they're called. But I mean, any thoughts on sort of going a director going back and sort of reimagining films?
Well, I think it's fine. I mean, George was ahead of the technology when he made the first films, and the technology finally caught up with what he wanted to do, and he was able to accomplish his original idea. But my concern is that he did away with the old version. So it would be fun to have the special edition, but it'd be also nice to have the original edition, which I don't think they make available. Though I don't follow Star Wars developments very closely. So
yeah, I think you're spot on. I don't think that they will ever be available, unfortunately. And they've been edited several times since as well, which I find crazy.
There's a Laserdisc edition of the first film, which I think is the best quality copy of the original cut, and I happen to have that version.
Nice.
And I have a disc player as well.
I bet they will both go fetch a pretty penny on eBay these days. Both of those things, the player and the discs themselves, especially your copy. But this week we are talking about Mission Impossible.
Yes.
And I've just gone back and revisited as well, for the episode, and I have a lot of questions about it. Now, I guess your involvement just comes from knowing Brian. Is that just a call he makes to ask you to come and do it with him? Where does the Mission Impossible story start for you?
Brian had been chosen to direct the film. It was Tom Cruise's first production. As a producer for the first time, and when I went off to do The Empire Strikes Back, Brian was preparing Dress to Kill in New York. And he said to me, who's going to cut Dress to Kill? My editor is going off. What am I going to do? So I said, well, the best editor in New York that I know of is Jerry Greenberg. And Jerry had cut The French Connection. And he is he's unfortunately passed away, but he was a fantastic editor whom I really respected and looked up to. He's about 10 years older than me, and he was the first editor from New York ever to win an Oscar. So I foolishly recommended Jerry to Brian, and he cut Dress to Kill and any number of films after that. I thought, well, that was dumb. You'll probably never get your job back. So I had done a number of pictures for Paramount when Mission Impossible was planned, and they liked me at the studio. I had done some successful films for them, including Footloose and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So they knew me and were they liked me. So Brian had hired Jerry to cut Mission Impossible.
Right.
And there was a dispute at the studio between Cruise and whoever was the head of the studio at the time. They wanted to bring it out for Christmas, and Cruise wanted to bring it out in the spring or the end of spring, play through the summer. So the studio won the argument. So I was hired. Brian called me. He said, we got to get this picture out fast. We got to do it really quickly. And Jerry's already been hired, but we'd like you to come. I'd like you to come and be the second editor. I said, great. So that's how it was.
Hmm. And this was such a different era for like adapting and known IP for the big screen. Were you and De Palma looking at the TV show at all, or was it very much no, that was its own thing? We are building the new cinematic version of Mission Impossible.
Well, that's not my job anyway. That would be Brian's job.
But were you like even looking at the show in terms of the rhythm of the film or anything?
Like I say, you follow your instincts based on the dailies.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I approach my work sort of like a dancer. So you go to a dance and they start to play. This dates me, of course. This is not for you young guys, but in old days, you go to a dance and they would play songs in different rhythms. So one would be a cha-cha, one would be a foxtrot, one would be a jitterbug or Charleston or whatever. So you listen to the music. Oh, okay, I know what to do, and sort of react to the music. And so that's my approach to dailies. I watch the dailies and I say, oh, I know what to do. I'll use this for that, and I'll use that for this, and and you put it together. So I'm not a film historian. I'm not a student of film. I'm a formerly practicing editor,
Mm-hmm.
and you focus on what's in front of you, and you interpret what's given to you through the lens of your own sensibility and your own instincts.
Right.
It has nothing to do with what went before, unless it's something about the film inspires you to resort to something like with all the wipes that we used in Star Wars, based on the idea that the film itself was based on serials from the 30s that played every Saturday.
Yeah.
They used that technique rather liberally, so we used it to evoke that nostalgia, for the old films. The great thing about Star Wars is that it took bits and pieces from all different kinds of films and chopped them up and made them into a fresh salad. It was like you have the Knights of the Round Table, and you have Tarzan films, and you have westerns, and you have aerial combat and westerns. You have all these different genres in one movie, sort of the result being that when you see Star Wars, you're not seeing a movie, you're seeing the movies. And everything evokes something that you're nostalgic about, but in a fresh way. So it's quite remarkable, actually. I didn't think we'd be talking about it 46 years later.
Yeah.
True. Well, with the first Mission film, at least we'll touch on the second one shortly. You by this point you mentioned some of the films you've done for Paramount. You'd also, of course, done Star Wars, won Academy Awards. Was the process of editing Mission Impossible anything different to what you've done before? Anything stands out about the process to you looking back on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was the first film that I did on computers.
Okay.
Working on film up to that point. This was the first time I was venturing into the new tools. We were working on a system called Lightworks, and they had some really wonderful qualities, but they didn't survive because they didn't constantly upgrade their software. So that was new. I hired an assistant who was familiar with Lightworks to sit next to me, and I'd say, I want to do this. How do I do that? And he'd show me. And when you're putting a film together for the first time, you're only using about 5 or 6 different commands over and over and over. So once I learned how to do those few things, I was off and running. It didn't take me very long at all to figure out what to do. There was an image of an imaginary piece of film, and see the image of what the film was, and it was an imaginary piece of film, an imaginary piece of soundtrack, and you can make an imaginary splice, and so it was all very visually intuitive and very easy to pick up. But I remember that the data storage was quite limited, so if I wanted to work on the next reel, they had to unplug reel 1 and wheel it out, and then bring in reel 2, plug in reel 2. It just wasn't, the capacity that we have today.
One of the things I find so impressive about the first Mission Impossible is that it's incredibly economical in its storytelling, but it's also like, I remember much was written at the time about it was a very complex story. I don't know that people would say that now in comparison to how complicated certain blockbuster films have become, but at the time it was, and your ability to balance a very propulsive, action-driven story with a lot of details that really reward paying attention. I'm just curious, like how much of that was kind of found in the editing room, finding that balance versus just what was delivered and kind of having a guideline right up front?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess what I mean is like, was there a strong sense of balancing sort of the propulsive action elements with like the more complex storytelling, or was that something that was like difficult to figure out, like kind of the balance?
No, I think what you see is pretty much the design of the film. We were sort of surprised that people were confused.
Yeah.
And I have a theory about that, which is that 3 weeks prior to the release of Mission Impossible, Paramount put out a picture called Twister, which is one of the stupidest movies I've ever seen.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the picture came out, and the critics, came to see Mission Impossible. Was sort of that. It just been a few weeks earlier from the same studio, and I think they went into it thinking, "Oh, another blockbuster," and they weren't really paying attention. I think they let their guard down, and then all of a sudden, what, and they're sort of behind the curve. I remember 10-year-old kids saw Mission Impossible, and they understood it fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the critics were sort of caught off guard, and I mean, that's my theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but a lot of the reviews said this is really confusing, and I think what part of the confusion might have been around a scene in the restaurant, the seafood restaurant with all the fish tanks.
Mm-hmm.
Cruise says, he has a line, he says, "This whole thing was a mole hunt." And I think people didn't get that line, or perhaps.
Sure.
Maybe, if we had looped it and made it more, if we had, I don't know. I mean, you do a lot of second guessing after people have criticized the film, but like I say, we understood it. We thought people would understand it, and a lot of people did understand it, but it got this label of being confusing.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Keeping the lights on at SpyHards HQ ain't cheap, and frankly, nor is feeding the school of attack piranhas. So we need your help.
Roger that, Scott. Only at the SpyHards Patreon can you gain access to exclusive shows like Agents in the Field, which tackles non-spy films starring your favorite spy icons, and The Debrief, where we channel our inner solitaires and predict how the big spy movie news of today will impact tomorrow.
So make like a Treadstone agent and activate your Patreon membership at patreon.com/spyhards today. Cam, tell the people what we have in our sights this week.
Well, Scott, our frightful Halloween festivities continue as we are looking at 1991's The People Under the Stairs. What happens when you cross Wes Craven with a couple of Twin Peaks icons? Venture into the crawl space with us and find out.
But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy chinks.
Have you found, with all of your De Palma collaborations, that they were often a few years ahead of their time? Because a lot of them not necessarily warmly received critically, and now there's so much talk about why can't we make movies like that now?
Yeah, definitely, most definitely. I mean, two of the films that we worked on and we had such high hopes for were complete disasters when they opened.
Mm-hmm.
One was Phantom of the Paradise, which got the Daily News in New York used to give 4 stars as their highest rating, and I think they gave Phantom of the Paradise a half a star.
Yeah,
Dismal flop at the box office when it opened. the picture opened in a theater in Paris and ran for 10 years. So, and then for some reason, I don't know if you know this as a Canadian, but in Winnipeg.
Yes.
Winnipeg is an annual Phantom Palooza. They have a festival every year around Phantom of the Paradise. So, and that's 40 some odd. What was it? 1974. What is that? 50. How many years? 49 years later.
Yeah. I actually did know that one of my best friend's husband grew up in Winnipeg, and The Phantom of the Paradise is his all-time favorite movie. He discovered it at those late-night screenings, and one day he made me actually watch the movie. He brought the DVD to work and made me watch it, and I fell in love with it as well. So, yes, I actually do know someone who was influenced by that Winnipeg popularity.
Yeah, so there's that. And then recently, not that recently, in 2014, I guess it was, they had a 40th anniversary cast and crew screening at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood, and the screening was sensational. The crowd reaction was everything we hoped for when it first came out, but never got. It was like delayed gratification. 40 years. We had to wait 40 years for that, but it was I mean, and then the other film that's I would say stands out in that respect is Blowout, which was considered a catastrophe when it opened, and now is considered De Palma's best picture.
Yep.
So times change. Well, the wonderful thing is that the release of a film is just its birth, and some of them go on to have long lives, and some become alcoholics and disappear, and others have very successful careers.
Well, speaking of ongoing, you did work on another Mission Impossible film a few years later with Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, the fourth of the running franchise, 7, I think, at this point. How did that come back to you? Because obviously it wasn't De Palma. It was Brad Bird running that production. How did that come back to you, and how did you get involved, I suppose?
Well, the story that I heard was that Brad Bird was presented with editors for Ghost Protocol, and he met these editors, and he would look at I don't know if he even met them. He would look at their credits, and he'd say, "No, I don't like the way these films were cut." And they were all action editors, and he objected to the way action scenes had started to become edited, and I have the same problem with them, that they become almost like you feel like you're watching a trailer for the scene as opposed to the scene itself.
Sure.
They don't respect time and space in a way that makes it believable. It just becomes a flurry of montage of action. You can't quite make out what's going on. So he said to the post supervisor, he said, "No, I want to cut like the way the first film was cut." So he said, "Well, I think that guy is still around."
Right. Yeah.
So that's how it came to me.
Well, I was just curious, the first one you mentioned, that's Tom Cruise's first production he's overseeing. Did you notice a real difference coming back to the franchise with Tom Cruise being more seasoned at this point as a creative driver of this series?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, actually, the thing that surprised me most about Cruise was that he remembered me. When we met up in Prague on the second film, he greeted me very warmly, and I hardly remembered speaking to him at all on the first film, because Brian had a rule that stars and producers are not allowed in the editing room.
Sure.
So I said to him, "Brian, Tom Cruise is the star and the producer of the picture. What are you going to do if he says he wants to come to the cutting room?" And Brian said, "He can screen the picture as much as he wants, as many times as he wants. He's not setting foot in the cutting room." And he never did. So my contact with Tom was very occasional and brief. And now it's 15 years later, and he greeted me very warmly. And I was very surprised that he, like I say, that he even remembered me. But he said, how are you? I said, I'm fine, but unlike you, I've changed in the last 15 years.
I think you could say that to him now and it would still hold up.
He looked exactly the same. Well, you can't tell by what he looks like on screen, because there's a lot of work that goes on in post to keep him youthful looking,
Don't ruin the illusion for me.
Well, not just with Tom. It happens with other actors as well.
Sure.
Yeah. There's a company in LA called Lola who specialize in removing these lines would be gone.
I'm just going to write that down, Paul. Lola. Right. I might need some help with that.
Do they have a payment plan?
Yeah. Layaway.
Yeah.
But the process of working with Brian, obviously something you practiced before, but had you worked with Brad Bird before at this point, and sort of what was that process like with him and feeling the film out and getting the final product in the second film?
Well, it's very different, and it was Brad's first film, first live action film. He was a brilliant, and is a brilliant animator, and he his process was very different and alien to me. And there were a couple of things I had to get used to. We'd look at an action sequence together, and he'd say, hang on, go back. I said, okay. He says, now just go one frame at a time, like that. I said, a frame at a time? He said, yeah. I said, I can't tell what I'm looking at a frame at a time. He said, well, I can't tell what I'm looking at if it's not a frame at a time. So I said, okay. So we would watch the sequence a frame at a time. And actually, I picked up some tips from him. He would say, go back, that frame, take that frame out. I would take the frame out, and the action would go a little faster.
Right.
That's interesting, And then, so I picked up some real tricks from him. But one of my concerns was that, editors have to have micro and macro points of view. So you have to zoom in and study a frame at a time. You also have to zoom out and look at the whole picture and see what the whole experience is, because what you're presenting to an audience, you're not presenting scenes, you're presenting a 2-hour experience. So you have to have that 2-hour experience to know what it feels like to an audience. And I could not get Brad to look at the picture.
Right.
I said, let's run the picture. He said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to work on, So we were getting to the point where we had to show the picture to J.J. Abrams, who was the producer. I said, Brad, we have to look at the picture. He says, I don't want to look at the picture. So I said, Brad, I need 2 hours this afternoon. I'm going to watch the picture, because if I don't watch the picture, I'm not doing my job. So he said, okay, I guess I'll watch it with you. So he consented to watch the whole picture, which is, I think it's a real rookie mistake. There's a sort of a canard going around in the industry that you should never, that directors are terrified to look at the rough cut, because the rough cut is you'll feel so terrible after the rough cut that you don't want to have that experience, So it's a real rookie mistake. And for the reason I just said, you have to have the whole experience to know what the audience is experiencing. So he agreed. I said, I'm going to watch it. So we started to watch it. And then he spent the whole time taking notes. So he would watch, and then he would write. And meanwhile, the picture is playing in front of him, and he's writing notes. He missed half the picture. And George Lucas, by contrast, liked to look at a picture twice, look at the rough cut twice. He would say, okay, let's just watch it. No notes. Nobody take any notes. Just watch the movie. Keep your eyes on the screen. And then we'd break for lunch. And then we'd come back and we'd watch it a second time. And this time we could take notes, because we knew what we had seen, and something we saw sparked a reaction, and we write it down. So that's a much more sensible approach. It's tedious, but there's a lot of tedium involved in editing. But it's a necessary step. somebody said, "What's the shortcut for making fruit salad?" And the answer is, there isn't one. You have to cut every piece. So you can't shortcut the process by saying, "Okay, I'm not going to watch the rough cut."
Mm-hmm.
Mistake, big mistake.
And you mentioned Tom Cruise not being allowed in the editing room for the first one, but did he get a bit of time in Ghost Protocol in there with you and Brad?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, toward the end, he came in, JJ and Tom and Brad and Berkey. I can't remember his real name. I just remember his nickname. They would sit on the couch, and I would, we'd talk about things. I write about this in my book that I would be the least powerful person in the room. You know, Cruise and J.J. Abrams, Brad Bird, and because I was the least threatening person in the room. I had no power to force any of my ideas, but because of that, I was able to suggest things that they went for. So I realized that powerlessness has its own power. That there's an advantage in being able to be the least important person in the room.
And is there any moment in either of the Mission Impossible films you edited that was more your influence on how the scene was put together, and some maybe a scene you could point to and be like, this is Paul's work right here. This is what I've perfected and created.
Well, that happens in every film. I mean, what we're doing is making choices, making decisions, and to the extent that the director endorses our choices is a measure of our satisfaction.
Sure.
My satisfaction. To the extent that the director looks at the scene and says, "Looks great," then I feel like I've done my job, and I take great pride in that. And I can point to a number of scenes in different films where the director saw what I'd done and said, "Great, there's no need to fuss around. It's fine." And the one I can think of in let me see, in Ghost Protocol, there's a scene where they're impersonating. They're making the switch. I can't remember the details. I haven't seen it since it came out. So that Cruise and is in one apartment and with Paula, I believe.
Yeah.
And then Simon and Jeremy are in the other apartment. Is that the way? They're one above the other.
Is this the one? This is the bit on the Burj Khalifa in that big tower block. Is that the scene?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hope you can make this sound coherent when you cut it together.
Oh, this is staying exactly as this is gold.
That scene where I cut between one apartment and the other, the door opens, now you're in the other apartment, and the door closes, and now you're back in the first apartment, and that whole intercut between the two apartments, one above the other, was never touched after my first cut. So, but it's like editors are, in a way, is sort of our process is sort of like an actor. An actor, Al Pacino, will do 10 takes of a line, and each one is his choice, how to play it. He'll read it 10 different ways because he's incapable of repeating himself, just because he's an artist and he can't do the same thing twice. It goes against something in him. So the director has to make the choice between, I endorse that choice, but not that one. So that's what we do in editing. We make choices, and the director endorses it or doesn't endorse it. It's the same kind of relationship creatively.
Now, I could probably keep asking you questions about Mission Impossible all the live long day, but I'm conscious of your time, so I've got a couple of quick fire questions to sort of wrap us up, Paul, if that works for you. The first one is, I mentioned it off the top. Your memoir came out a couple of years ago now, a long time ago in a cutting room far, far away. But what inspired you to actually want to put that memoir together?
Well, I was in Vancouver, and my wife was in LA, and I had been visiting the floor and chatting with actors and producers and so forth. And I would tell these stories, and I would get some good laughs. And on the weekend, I was alone because my wife was back home, and I was bored. I had nothing to do, and I thought I should really write these stories down because they're pretty good stories. And so who knows? Maybe someday I'll make a book out of them or something. So that's what I did. I started writing the stories down, and at that time, I made a list of each of the pictures I'd worked on and little notes about anecdotes, things that happened that I remembered that were good stories, and so I made this outline, and then I worked on it for the next 18 years. I started in 1999.
Wow.
And I finished the first draft in 2017. But there were years, I mean, it would go 2 or 3 years without my working on it at all. And as I got older and less attractive to the business, my periods of employment grew less lengthy, and my periods of unemployment grew more lengthy. And I had more and more time to work on the book, and I finally finished it in 2017. So, and then I got an agent, and then I worked on it. I worked on the editing for another year or so of the book with a very good editor, woman named Jenny Shute.
Yeah, we'll have links in the show notes below for everyone. Go click on that and grab a copy. I did want to ask, and it's kind of might be not particularly a quick fire question, but maybe it could be brief. But of all these films that we've listed that you've worked on, and plenty more that we haven't even spoken about, is there one when you were in that editing room putting it together, you were like, this is magic, this is going to be the next big thing? I mean, maybe that was Star Wars, maybe that was Mission, maybe that was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but was there one where you were just sat there and go, this is magic right here?
Well, there are always scenes in each film that I get off on. I mean, I really enjoyed cutting Ray. I think Ray doesn't get as much credit as it deserves. I love editing to music. There are scenes in Footloose. I never make a judgment about the whole film. I mean, that's not true. I know when I'm working on something that's not the greatest, but you have to work and you have to make a living. So you take what's available to you at the time. But yeah, there are films I get excited about. I wouldn't say that I know that this picture is going to be a success, because you never know that. But yeah, there's always some magic. I did a film that was not successful called The Fighting Temptations, and there's innumerable sequences in that I think are just fantastic.
Well, okay, what we'll do now, I'll throw to the last question, and this is one we've asked every single person we've ever had on the show. Putting you in the hot seat now, Paul. What is your favorite spy movie of all time?
That's a tough one. I was going to say North by Northwest, but I find that sometimes when I go back to old films, they don't stand up to my memory of them, especially with Hitchcock. You remember the highlights, but you don't remember the boring bits in between.
To be fair, I think my answer would probably be one of Hitchcock's spy films. I think they still rock now.
Yeah, I think Saboteur is pretty great also.
Yeah. I can't say I actually watched North by Northwest just last night. Holds up beautifully. Just total coincidence, but yeah.
Okay, I'll go with that.
It's a beautiful answer. I think it's probably in my top 5, so I can't fault you for that. Well, Paul, it's been a wonderful experience speaking to you, sir. I could keep picking your brain for another 4 hours, but I'm sure you have a lovely day ahead of you, so I don't want to take up any more time. But yeah, thank you for your time, Paul.
After 4 hours, you'd be picking through crumbs.
But I'd still be picking. No, Paul, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking to you. I wish you all the best, and thank you for your time, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat with Mr. Paul Hirsch. Again, I want to thank Paul for taking the time to speak with us. And if you want to hear more of his stories, we recommend you go and check out his memoir, A Long Time Ago, in a cutting room far, far away. There's a link in the show notes below. But Cam, throwing it over to you. I mean, what a chat. What a guy.
Yeah, like, we've talked to many luminaries from the history of film and television. And Mr. Hirsch has had such a profound impact on my life. I was a Star Wars kid. Star Wars is really the first movie that ever kind of drew me into the art form. I would say like early Disney stuff, but it was discovering Star Wars when my parents showed it to me when I was like 4 years old and would watch it over and over again and just fell in love with that universe. So, like I grew up worshiping and studying those movies to pieces, and Brian De Palma films have played a huge role in my life as an adult, where all of De Palma's early stuff are movies I revisit constantly, and it was fascinating to talk to someone who played such a key role in creating these absolutely visionary works that, as I mentioned in the interview, Star Wars aside, a lot of them not appreciated as much in their time, but now are seen as like legendary films.
Are you saying you were the original Star Wars kid?
I was not the original. That would imply that I saw it in theaters, but I saw it on TV or something like that at 4 years old. But I was, I guess, maybe the first generation of children who were brought up on Star Wars.
Sure. I was definitely a generation after you for that. But I had the same upbringing with Star Wars. I remember seeing all of the original in theaters before Phantom Menace came out and experiencing them on the big screen and at quite a young age and just being blown away by them. But I had already watched them on VHS by that point and knew and loved them. But also, like, I liked films like Ferris Bueller. I think it's a film I go back to often. It's like a perfect 80s comedy, and it's interesting to know that like all these roads came from Brian De Palma films. All these, that's where he started, and all this led into Mission Impossible, the film we're talking about this week. And it goes to show the pedigree. That's something we've spoken about a little bit, but the pedigree behind Mission Impossible, especially this first one. Having Brian De Palma as the director was a masterstroke, but again, having Paul and the rest of the team there as well, I couldn't think of a better set of hands to guide this franchise from TV to the big screen.
No, and it's such a confident film.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for a movie that's going to launch a franchise, I don't know at the time if they were thinking this is going to be a 7-film, 8-film franchise.
They were hoping.
But they were hoping, but they wanted a big, blockbuster film that audiences would get excited about. And the movie is so confident in its vision, and they have, minus little tweaks to character and tone, they've stuck pretty true to the vision of what this original Mission Impossible was throughout the run, the way it balances kind of complicated, almost comic book spy stories with like these really intricate, involving action sequences. Like the balance and tone of those sorts of sequences is pretty well set up in that first movie and has continued onwards.
Absolutely. But let's talk about Paul's contribution to some of the things we discussed. I mean, hearing some of the revelations, just talking about perhaps Star Wars first, because that's how the conversation started. We were talking off air before the interview started, and you were sort of telling me the details of this fabled directors meeting screening of Star Wars before it was fully edited. And I'd never heard of it until you told me, but it's a fascinating story. But actually hearing it from someone who was actually in the room must have been a dream come true for you.
Yeah, this was like Hollywood lore. You hear people talk about this screening. I think George Lucas has told anecdotes. Pretty sure Brian De Palma has told anecdotes about it as well. And to actually have that eyewitness account of someone who was there, I could actually explain the experience of that screening. I mean, this was one for the history books, folks. This was a very amazing story to have on the podcast.
And just to hear that someone's ribbing George Lucas.
Yeah.
Like, I'm all for that. I'm not a big fan of what he did with the franchise towards the end of his tenure with Star Wars, but yeah, I'm glad Brian De Palma was sticking it to George.
Well, this was like the movie brat era. I believe that was the nickname for those directors, where it was like De Palma, Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, Ron Howard. They were like this generation of directors who were all brought up watching films and were like the ones kind of changing the industry. They were the ones that very much shaped the way that big budget filmmaking was going, often in very experimental projects. All of that early De Palma stuff was pretty bold and daring, and now is the sort of thing that you see a lot of filmmakers working in mainstream film aspire to try to achieve. They were the people very much shaping the popular entertainment that was going to come. And just to hear about I mean, these guys would have been pretty young. And the idea of like Brian De Palma ribbing George Lucas about this silly space movie he's made, like it's so
What's
much.
with those tractor beams? What's that about?
Yeah, it's so much fun with like the context now of knowing what Star Wars has become in our culture.
Yeah, as we're like surrounded by Lego Star Wars everywhere and everything, we can't escape Star Wars now. I'm sure Disney's listening.
They just announced 3 new movies. Like Star Wars is huge business now. It's an entire industry. And once upon a time, it was a very concerned George Lucas showing, a very rough cut of this movie to a group of friends who were, I guess, concerned.
Yeah, for sure. And like hearing how Paul was brought in after a few unsuccessful edits to the film were made to try and punch it up along with a couple other people, and then he was the sort of the final editor on the film, and of course went on to win the Academy Award for it as well.
Yeah, and he shared that Oscar with Marshall Lucas and Richard Chew. And I mean, yeah, like Star Wars really changed the game in terms of blockbuster action storytelling. And, Paul comes across very humble when he talks about his craft and his achievements in films over the many years that he worked in Hollywood. But I mean, it's a little bit like when we talked to Gary Powell, someone who is also very modest about, the productions he's done and saying, look, I had an amazing team. We got a lot of cool things done. But when you kind of track the filmographies, you go, boy, they happen to be there at these kind of like this string of very pivotal films that changed the way we watch movies.
Yeah, I mean, you move on from sort of the Star Wars discussion. You talk about, which we didn't really get into, but the string of like what I would call seminal 80s films. Everything from like going back to the beginning, like you got Footloose, Ferris Bueller, Planes, Trains, Automobiles, Steel Magnolias is a film I hear people talking about quite a lot. Blowout, you mentioned at the start of the 80s. He did stuff on the Creep Show. I think it's a segment from Creep Show he did. Like he was a part of the 80s experience for many people.
Yeah, a lot of people's favorite movies were edited by Paul Hirsch. And actually, a lot of these movies that you mentioned were standards on TV. So you had a lot of people that grew up in this particular era seeing these movies replayed on TV again and again. So they internalized them in a way that I feel like is not as frequent now just because of streaming and the number of options people have. People don't have these touchstone movies that just get absorbed over and over again. But that's very much the case with a lot of his, especially 80s work and also 70s.
Well, except Morbius, obviously.
Obviously.
The touchstone of cinema, as it is now.
Of course.
Yes, of course. I suppose then moving on to our topic this week, Mission Impossible. And again, like, it's clear that Paul is a man who really loved his work. That's why he wrote about it afterwards as well. And he just sort of gets stuck in with the craft. He obviously has a good shorthand with his director and just gets the job done. But like hearing stories about Tom Cruise being banned from the cutting room from him and Brian De Palma, like I just love that idea of Brian De Palma and Paul just sort of holding little Tom Cruise back away from the door, and he's like, "Oh, let me at him," and couldn't do it. I just love that idea.
And also, it's interesting, when we've talked to various people who work behind the scenes on films, like they all have a different creative process in how they deal with the job at hand. And like to hear Paul talk about the intuitive approach to editing and the way he decides on how the film should be shaped, what the ultimate result is. It's very much like a process that feels very individual to him. And I really enjoyed hearing him just talk about how that works, because sometimes that's a hard thing to communicate to people.
Sure.
And everyone has a different way of doing it. And so I think he did a just fabulous job of underlining essentially what he does as an editor on these films, all very different films too, and how he kind of arrives at a final result.
And also just interesting knowing that him nor Brian De Palma really looked to the TV show for inspiration.
Yeah.
Like it was, but like for me, as someone who's watched a few episodes of the show now, I can see it, especially in the beginning, like the beginning mission that goes awry. I can see a lot of the TV show in that.
Yeah. To me, like there is a similar energy and vibe. But I also understood like it was an era where you didn't necessarily look at the original IP as much for inspiration. Like nowadays, they would be pouring over it because they want to have Easter eggs for the fans and all that sort of stuff. Whereas in this era, not as much the case. You know, I don't know that when they were making The Fugitive a few years before this, the original Mission Impossible, they were like, how many nods to the TV show can we fit in? I don't think very many.
I mean, we've had Andrew Davis on and we didn't ask about that, but we probably should have.
Yeah, probably. We were sleeping on the job there. But one thing I thought was really interesting too was often with films you hear about how there was, say, a lot of problems and they had to find it in the editing room. And that was one thing I was very curious about with the first Mission Impossible, was just finding that balance between the action and the plot. That he talked about how a lot of people complained it was confusing. I remember actually for me it does stand out in that it was one of the first movies that my friends and I really became obsessed with and would watch over and over again, trying to like piece together the plot. And it's not like, when I watch it now, the plot's not that complicated.
No.
But it felt smarter than I think a lot of the blockbusters. And he referenced Twister at the time, but also Independence Day was in 96, Eraser, the Schwarzenegger film. Mission Impossible felt like it was asking a little more of the audience, which I think was something that really worked in its favor. And a attitude you would see like Christopher Nolan had when he's doing, say, The Dark Knight. Like, you're asking something of the audience, but they are paying off your investment. And it was just interesting to me how it seemed like that was very well mapped out. That was not the sort of thing that kind of was happened upon by accident.
And I think one thing that helps us is maybe the fact that we study spy movies now. Maybe we're just so like ingrained in this world that we can watch this film and be like, oh, this all makes perfect sense. But I wonder what the experience would be like if I sat my mother down to watch this film. And I wonder if she would tell me that it is confusing.
Yeah, I don't know.
But also, he worked on Ghost Protocol.
Yeah.
It's one of the only people to sort of have a continuity. Obviously, Christopher McQuarrie has sort of had a continuity going. But you were telling me earlier that the idea of these films was to have a whole new team every time and a new vision. So it's interesting that Brad Bird, the director of Ghost Protocol, actually wanted to have the original editor come back because he wanted to keep that editing style from the first film. I think it's probably a good choice. But a completely different dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear him talk about working with Brad Bird, because Brad Bird came from the world of animation, and just his approach to storytelling would be very different, because animation is so meticulous and takes years. Like, you know, Brad Bird, who had done Iron Giant, The Incredibles, those movies, they just like fine tool as precisely as possible over a long period of time. So I can understand his obsession with the details over the bigger picture in a way.
Sure,
but it was interesting to hear how like the two approaches to Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol were quite different in terms of the editor and the director. But the final results, you can't argue with.
Nope, you can't. I mean, many would say Mission Impossible 3 is a turning point, but a lot would also point to 4 is where it really finds its kind of the formula of what it looks to now. Like 4, for a lot of people, is the Goldfinger of the Mission Impossibles.
Yeah, I really do love Part 4, and I remember that was the one. I really enjoyed 3, but I recall 4 being the one that got me really excited about the franchise continuing.
Yeah, I think that there's an escalation in scale from the 4th one onwards where that really starts to ramp up. But we're talking about a film that we haven't spoken about yet. I suppose overall, it never ceases to amaze me, and I constantly try to humble myself of just the luck that we have when it comes to guests.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's not often you get to speak to people that are involved in your favorite films. And the fact that we get to tie that into a conversation of a film we both enjoy talking about as well, and just to hear some stories about how that was put together, I think is absolutely invaluable. And it's one of the reasons that I still love doing this podcast 3 years later.
It's one of the gifts of the spy movie genre is that when you track kind of the history of these movies and talk to the people associated with them, it ties into all these other various elements of the history of film. So, like, we may be talking about Mission Impossible, but, you know, the editor, Paul Hirsch, Star Wars, you know, Empire Strikes Back, Ferris Bueller, like, there's all these other movies that they worked on. So you get to not just cover the stuff that we are focused on within the genre of this podcast, but all these other amazing films that have shaped our enthusiasm of film as a whole.
Well, you go back to our first, I guess, Mission Impossible interview many moons ago now with Dan Mindell, who was the cinematographer of Mission Impossible 3 as well as Spy Game.
Yeah.
But he also worked on Star Trek, and that's where our love sort of is, and how our connection first started. So it's always nice to have these opportunities to sort of dig into people's filmographies, and I'm always glad that people will have time to talk to us about it.
Yeah, and actually Dan Mindell also from Star Wars did Force Awakens.
But yeah, an absolutely wonderful chat. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm glad we're finally here, Cam. It's about damn time.
That's right.
But the question goes to you, sir. What are we looking at next week?
We are going to be looking at the 1975 Clint Eastwood espionage thriller, The Eiger Sanction.
Yes, yes, yes. Stick on your snow boots. We're going to go climb a mountain with Clint. I'm looking forward to it. So your mission, folks, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as we tackle 1975's The Eiger Sanction. A good year for spy films. I think 3 Days of the Condor came out the same year.
That is correct, yeah. Like the 70s, not a huge decade for spy movies, but some of the really, really great ones came out of this decade.
Yeah. Man with the Golden Gun too.
Of course, one of the all-timers, yes.
And if you like what you heard on this interview this week, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, hasta lasagna. Don't get any on ya.